On the morning of April 14, 1912, the wireless operator aboard the RMS Carpathia noted in his log that the weather had been unusually calm for 3 days running. This observation, preserved in the Marconi Company archives at the Bodleian Library, appears 17 pages before the entry that would define his career. It is mentioned here not for its drama, but for what it reveals about perception. That stillness, when prolonged, becomes indistinguishable from safety. This account does not concern the Carpathia. It concerns a group of people who made a similar mistake 4 years earlier, in circumstances far less examined by history. In the autumn of 1908, a geological survey expedition departed from Dawson City, Yukon Territory, with the intention of mapping mineral deposits along the upper Stewart River before the first heavy snows. The party consisted of 6 men: Chief Geologist Howard Pennington, his assistant Charles Dorn, Camp Supervisor Frank Healy, 2 packers named Emil Brask and Robert Caulfield, and a cook, Samuel Yu, whose presence in the expedition records is noted only in payroll documents and a single photograph. They left on September 9th. The last steamer service from Stewart Crossing to Dawson was scheduled for October 12th. This gave them 33 days, a margin Pennington described in his initial report as more than adequate for the survey's limited scope. The expedition's purpose was narrow: to assess quartz formations in a 12-mile stretch of river valley that had shown trace gold content during a previous summer survey. Pennington had been explicit in his correspondence with the Canadian Geological Survey that this was not an exploratory venture. It was, in his words, confirmatory fieldwork of the most routine character. The region was not unmapped. Indigenous Hen and northern Tuchone people had traveled these routes for generations. White prospectors had worked the creeks since the Klondike Rush, a decade prior. There were 3 established camps within a 2-day walk. The Stewart River itself was a known quantity, broad, cold, and navigable by small craft until the freeze. Weather patterns were equally familiar. The first snows typically arrived in late September, but serious accumulation rarely began before mid-October. Temperatures dropped steadily through autumn, but the transition from uncomfortable to dangerous was understood to be gradual. Men who worked in the Yukon planned around these rhythms. They were not careless. Pennington's equipment list, preserved in survey records, reflects this confidence. 3 canvas tents, 2 weeks of hardtack and cured meat with instructions to supplement by hunting, geological hammers, sample bags, a transit and chains for mapping, 1 rifle, and 2 shotguns. Notably absent, snowshoes, though Healy had suggested them. Pennington's marginal note on the inventory reads, "Unnecessary. Survey concludes before conditions warrant." The expedition traveled light. They moved upriver by canoe for the first 4 days, cached their boats at a bend, later identified as approximately 63 degrees north latitude, and proceeded on foot into the valley. Dorn's field notes describe the pace as leisurely. Pennington stopped frequently to sketch outcrops. The men made camp each afternoon by 3 o'clock. On September 17th, 8 days into the survey, Dorn recorded the temperature at dawn as 31 degrees Fahrenheit. He noted frost on the tent fabric. In the same entry, he mentioned that Healy had asked Pennington whether they should consider abbreviating the survey. Pennington's reply is documented. "We are well ahead of schedule. There is no cause for concern." This was true. They had covered more ground than anticipated. The weather, while cool, remained clear. They had encountered no difficulties. The last entry in Dorn's notebook before they turned back toward the river is dated September 23rd. It describes the completion of the mapping work and includes a small notation at the bottom of the page. Healy again expressed preference for early departure. Pennington replied that we had 4 days in hand and might as well be thorough. Survey extended to include additional outcrop 2 miles west. The official expedition report, filed the following spring, contains a single sentence about this decision. At this juncture, the party still possessed sufficient time to return to the river and meet the scheduled transport without hardship. They did possess sufficient time, but only if nothing changed. The assumption underlying Pennington's decision that conditions would remain stable was not irrational. It was based on pattern recognition, which is how human beings navigate uncertainty. For 10 consecutive days, the weather had been cold but clear. For 10 consecutive days, the work had proceeded without incident. These facts created a framework in which extending the survey by 48 hours appeared reasonable. Dawn's field notes from September 24th and 25th describe continued mapping work. The additional outcrop Pennington wished to examine proved less promising than anticipated, but the effort was not wasted. Samples were collected. Sketches were completed. On the evening of the 25th, Pennington announced that they would depart for the river the following morning. The men prepared for the return with the same methodical calm that had characterized the entire expedition. Healy inventoried supplies and found them adequate. Brask and Caulfield organized the packs. Yu prepared a hot meal. The temperature had dropped. Dorn recorded 18 degrees at dusk, but this was not alarming. September nights in the Yukon were expected to be cold. What changed overnight was not temperature but sky. At dawn on September 26th, the valley was obscured by low cloud. Dorn noted overcast conditions and diffuse light making transit work impractical. The cloud ceiling was perhaps 200 feet above the valley floor. Visibility extended 50 yards. There was no precipitation. Pennington decided to wait until the cloud lifted before beginning the trek back to the river. This decision appears in no formal record, but it can be inferred from the fact that the party remained in camp throughout the morning of the 26th. Healy later testified that Pennington had expressed confidence the overcast would burn off by midday, as it typically did in autumn. It did not burn off. At noon, Dawn recorded conditions unchanged. At 2 in the afternoon, he noted light snow beginning. The snow was not heavy. Dawn described it as intermittent flurries, accumulation negligible. The temperature remained in the low 20s. By modern standards, these were poor conditions for travel, but not prohibitive. The difficulty was one of judgment. At what point does poor become dangerous? Pennington waited. His reasoning, reconstructed from later testimony, appears to have been that starting a 12-mile hike through broken country in low visibility and light snow was less prudent than waiting for improvement. The men had shelter. They had food. The river was not far. 12 miles could be covered in a single hard day or 2 easy ones. There was no reason to believe the weather would worsen significantly. This was the second miscalculation, though it did not feel like one at the time. The snow continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Dawn's entry for September 26th concludes. Healy advocated immediate departure despite conditions. Pennington overruled. Decision made to wait for clearing and depart at first light tomorrow. There is no indication in Dawn's writing that this decision was controversial. Healy's objection is recorded matter-of-factly, as one might note a difference of opinion about the quality of the coffee. The tone suggests that men accustomed to working together had aired a minor disagreement and moved on. They did not know, could not have known, that the weather system settling over the valley was not a typical autumn storm. It was the leading edge of an early Arctic intrusion, a meteorological event that occurs perhaps once in a decade. The Yun cover that had seemed temporary was, in fact, thickening. The light snow that had seemed manageable would, by morning, become something else entirely. But on the evening of September 26th, none of this was apparent. The men ate dinner. Yu later recalled that the conversation had been ordinary, discussions of the survey's findings, speculation about whether the samples would justify a return expedition, complaints about the cold. Pennington mentioned that they would need to move quickly the next day to reach the river by nightfall. But his tone, according to Yu's testimony, was businesslike, not concerned. They slept under canvas while 6 inches of snow accumulated outside. Dawn's field notebook contains no entry for September 27th, but a reconstruction of that day can be assembled from testimony given during the inquiry conducted the following spring. The men woke to 8 inches of snow on the ground and more falling steadily. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility, according to Healy's later account, was perhaps 20 feet. The cloud ceiling had lowered to the point where the ridgelines defining the valley were no longer visible. Pennington called a meeting. The discussion that followed was later described by multiple witnesses with remarkable consistency, which suggests it was not particularly heated. The options were straightforward: remain in camp until the weather cleared, or attempt to travel in whiteout conditions without clear landmarks. Healy argued for immediate departure. His reasoning, as he later explained, was that the snow was already deep enough to make travel difficult, and waiting would only make it worse. He believed they could follow the valley floor back to the cached canoes, even in poor visibility. It was a matter of compass work and discipline. Pennington disagreed. He pointed out that 12 miles through 8 inches of snow in near-zero visibility with packs would take far longer than normal. The risk of becoming disoriented was significant. If they missed the canoes or misjudged their position on the river, they could find themselves in serious difficulty. Better, he argued, to wait until they could see where they were going. Brask and Caulfield, when asked, sided with Pennington. Dorn stated that he was uncertain, but deferred to Pennington's judgment. Yu, whose testimony was taken through an interpreter, said he had not been asked for his opinion. The decision was made to remain in camp. It was not a unanimous decision, but neither was it fractious. These were practical men making what they believed to be a practical choice. The snow would stop. The visibility would improve. They had food for several more days. There was no emergency. The snow did not stop. By evening on the 27th, accumulation had reached 14 inches. The temperature was 9 degrees. Dorn, who resumed keeping notes on a loose sheet of paper after his notebook filled, recorded, "Conditions deteriorating. Healy insists we must leave at first light, regardless of visibility." Pennington non-committal. That night, for the first time, Yu heard men discussing the possibility that they might not make the scheduled steamer. The conversation, as he recalled it, was speculative rather than alarmed. If they missed the October 12th departure, they would need to winter over in Dawson. Inconvenient, but not catastrophic. The survey would cover expenses. They would be home by spring. No one yet understood that the margin they had possessed 3 days earlier had evaporated entirely. September 28th brought 16 inches of snow and sustained winds. The temperature was 6 degrees. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The decision to attempt travel was no longer a matter of debate. It was impossible. The storm continued for 4 days. During this period, the camp's situation transformed from uncomfortable to precarious. Fuel for the fire became difficult to find under the snow. Food stores, calculated for a short expedition, began to run low. The men remained in good spirits. There are no accounts of panic or despair, but the tone of later testimony suggests a dawning awareness that they had misread the situation badly. On October 2nd, the snow stopped. The sky cleared. The temperature was -2 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow depth was estimated at 28 inches. Pennington announced they would depart immediately. The 12-mile trek to the river took 3 days. The men had no snowshoes. They took turns breaking trail. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards. Dorn's notes described the effort as exhausting but manageable. They reached the cached canoes on the evening of October 4th. The Stewart River was frozen solid. This was the moment when the full scope of their miscalculation became clear. They had missed the window for water travel, but there was not yet sufficient ice for safe passage on foot. The river, which had been their exit route, was now an impassable barrier. Healy proposed that they abandon the canoes and attempt to walk the 70 miles down the riverbank to Stewart Crossing. Pennington agreed. There was no alternative. They departed on October 5th. Food was critically low, perhaps 3 days' worth at reduced rations. The men were already fatigued from the trek out of the valley. The temperature had stabilized in the single digits, cold enough to be dangerous but not immediately life-threatening if they kept moving. They made approximately 8 miles the first day. On the morning of October 6th, Brask complained of numbness in his feet. Healy examined him and found evidence of frostbite. The decision was made to reduce the pace. They covered 6 miles. October 7th, 4 miles. Caulfield began to lag. Dawn's notes describe visible exhaustion across the group. October 8th. Pennington proposed they establish a base camp and send 2 men ahead to seek help. Healy and Dawn volunteered. They departed at first light with minimal gear, leaving Pennington, Brask, Caulfield and Yu in camp. Healy and Dawn reached Stewart Crossing on the afternoon of October 10th. They had walked approximately 60 miles in 60 hours. A rescue party was organized immediately and departed the next morning. The rescue party found Pennington, Brask, Caulfield and Yu on October 13th, 21 miles from their last position. All 4 men were alive, but severely weakened. Brask required the amputation of 3 toes. Caulfield suffered permanent damage to his hands. Yu developed pneumonia during the evacuation and spent 6 weeks in hospital. Pennington kept walking under his own power until he reached Dawson City on October 15th. He filed his report the next day. The inquiry into the expedition's difficulties convened in February 1909. It was not a formal legal proceeding. No charges were contemplated, but rather an administrative review conducted by the Canadian Geological Survey to determine what had gone wrong and whether protocol changes were warranted. Transcripts of the testimony are preserved in the National Archives in Ottawa. They run to 83 pages and are remarkable primarily for their lack of recrimination. The men did not blame one another. They blamed weather, timing, and judgment. Pennington's testimony occupies 12 pages. He accepted full responsibility for the decision to extend the survey and for the subsequent delays. When asked whether he would make the same decisions again, he replied, "With the information available at the time, my choices were defensible. In hindsight, they were catastrophic errors. I cannot reconcile these 2 facts except to say that weather can change more quickly than judgment adapts to it." Healy was asked why he had not pressed his objections more forcefully. He responded, "I expressed my concerns clearly. Mr. Pennington was the senior man. I deferred to his authority because I believed at the time that his assessment was at least plausible. By the time it became clear that he was wrong, the opportunity to act had passed." Dawn was asked whether he had felt afraid at any point during the ordeal. He said, "No, not afraid. Apprehensive, yes, but the danger always felt. I struggle for the word theoretical. Even when the snow kept falling, even when we were walking through it, it did not feel as though we might die. It felt as though we had made an error that would cost us discomfort. The gap between discomfort and death is very small, I now understand." Caulfield, whose hands were still bandaged during his testimony, was asked what he would have done differently. He replied, "I would have left when Healy said to leave, not because I thought Pennington was wrong, but because when someone with experience tells you to move, you should move. I did not think this at the time. I do now." Brask's testimony was brief. He had little to add beyond noting that frostbite did not hurt until it was too late to prevent it. Yu, testifying through an interpreter, was asked whether he had understood the decisions being made. He said, "I understood that the snow was deep and we were far from town. I did not understand that we were in danger until Mr. Healy said we must walk very fast for a long time. Even then, I thought we would be cold and tired, not hurt. I was wrong." The inquiry's final report, issued in March 1909, concluded that the expedition had suffered a cascade of minor miscalculations, which, in aggregate, produced serious consequences. It noted that Pennington's decisions, while flawed, were not unreasonable given the information available to him at each juncture. The report recommended that all future expeditions include explicit weather contingency protocols and that senior geologists receive additional training in backcountry risk assessment. Pennington continued working for the Canadian Geological Survey until his retirement in 1928. He published 7 monographs on Yukon mineral deposits. None of them mention the 1908 expedition. Healy left survey work after the inquiry and became a schoolteacher in Vancouver. In a 1947 interview with a local historical society conducted when he was 73, he was asked about his most memorable experience in the Yukon. He spoke about the Stewart River expedition. The interviewer asked whether he felt vindicated by subsequent events. Healy replied, "Vindicated? No, I was right, but being right did not make us safer. We were lucky, all of us, that the mistakes we made were not quite bad enough to kill us." Dawn returned to university and completed a doctorate in geology. His 1913 dissertation on quartz formations includes a footnote thanking the members of the 1908 Stewart River Survey, whose perseverance under difficult conditions made this research possible. He did not elaborate. Brask moved to Seattle and worked as a longshoreman. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. Caulfield lost enough dexterity in his fingers that he could not continue work as a packer. He became a clerk in a mining supply office in Whitehorse. Yu returned to Vancouver's Chinatown. Census records show him working as a cook in various establishments until at least 1921. No further information about his life has been located. None of the men wrote memoirs. None gave extensive interviews. The expedition became a minor footnote in the survey's institutional history, an example used in training materials for a few years, then gradually forgotten. The samples Pennington collected were analyzed in 1909. The quartz formations showed no commercially viable gold content. The survey's findings were never published. The archival record of the 1908 Stewart River expedition occupies less than 2 linear feet of shelf space in the National Archives. It consists of field notebooks, correspondence, payroll documents, the inquiry transcript, and a few photographs. The photographs show 6 men standing in front of tents. They are not smiling, but they do not look apprehensive. They look like men at work, which is what they were. There is no drama in these materials. No single decision that stands out as obviously wrong. No moment where someone ignored a clear warning. Just a series of small delays, each one defensible, each one reducing the margin for error until that margin disappeared entirely. The question the inquiry attempted to answer, what went wrong, is less interesting than the question it did not ask. What made the men believe day after day that nothing was wrong? The answer appears to be that danger does not announce itself clearly. It accumulates. On September 24th, extending the survey by 2 days seemed reasonable because the weather was holding. On September 26th, waiting for the overcast to lift seemed prudent because traveling in poor visibility was risky. On September 27th, remaining in camp seemed necessary because moving in a whiteout was dangerous. Each decision was locally rational. Together they were catastrophic. This is not unusual. Most disasters in well-documented history follow similar patterns. The men who died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911 worked behind locked doors every day for months before the fire. The locks seemed normal until they were not. The passengers who remained on the Eastland in 1915 while it listed thought the tilting was temporary until the ship rolled over. The miners who descended into Monongah in 1907 had worked in unstable tunnels for years without incident. The mountain seemed solid until it collapsed. The Stewart River expedition is noteworthy precisely because it was not a disaster. The men survived. But they survived not because they made good decisions after the initial mistakes, but because the margin for error, which they thought they had, lasted just barely long enough. Healy testified that they missed death by perhaps 6 miles and 2 days. If the rescue party had been delayed, if the weather had been slightly colder, if Brask's frostbite had been slightly worse, any of these differences would have changed the outcome. The men knew this. Pennington's testimony includes a passage where he describes walking along the Stewart River in early October, exhausted and hungry, calculating whether they would reach help in time. He said, "I did not feel afraid. I felt foolish. We had done this to ourselves, and for what? For 2 extra days of fieldwork that meant nothing. The expedition achieved nothing. The mineral deposits were not economically viable. The maps they produced duplicated existing knowledge. The samples they collected gathered dust in storage for decades before being discarded during a records purge in the 1950s. What the expedition demonstrated, with painful clarity, was that time is not a renewable resource. Once spent, it cannot be reclaimed. The men had 33 days to complete their work and return. They used 26 of them. Then they needed 7 more and did not have them. This is the mechanics of disaster. You continue as normal until normal is no longer possible, and then you discover that you needed to act 3 days ago. The archival materials offer no moral. The men were competent. They were experienced. They made reasonable choices that turned out to be wrong. This happens. What remains is a set of documents describing a minor incident in which no one died, nothing of value was accomplished, and several men learned that safety is not a state, but a duration, and that duration is always shorter than it appears. The 1908 Stuart River expedition would be entirely forgotten if not for a single detail. The inquiry transcript, which captures men attempting to explain why they did not act sooner, is an almost perfect record of human beings discovering, too late, that time does not pause for reconsideration. Healy's final words to the inquiry were, "We thought we had time. That was the mistake. Not that we were lazy or careless or foolish, just that we thought we had time." The transcript notes that after this statement, there was a long silence. No one asked another question.